The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time. Without objection, members of the full committee not on this subcommittee are authorized to participate in today's hearing. This hearing is entitled Safe and Decent, examining the current state of residents' health and safety in HUD housing. I now recognize myself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. For decades, the Department of Housing and Urban Development has ensured that millions of Americans have a safe, decent, and affordable place to call home. However, today, many residents face ongoing issues with the physical conditions of their homes due to chronic underfunding, insufficient HUD oversight and enforcement, and lack of compliance with HUD requirements by some landlords participating in HUD programs. While the majority of public and assisted housing is safe for its residents, increasingly, these properties are aging and require capital investments and improvements to ensure residents live in safe environments. Today's hearing will examine what HUD has done, review some of the current problems, and most importantly, look at ways we can come together to help HUD better serve communities like one that I represent of Wellston, Missouri in St. Louis County, or Cordova Courts in Opelika, Florida, and the over 100 public housing developments in New York City. I was encouraged to read the testimony of St. Louis's own Susan Rollins, who spoke about the importance of housing or health outcomes from the perspective of someone working in the trenches every day to provide low-income families with safe and decent housing. However, Ms. Rollins' job gets harder by the year as Congress continues to underfund the public housing program. As a result, more families are now being forced to live in conditions that no one should have to face. In fact, last year, funding for public housing repairs had fallen 35% since the year 2000, and more than 10,000 public housing homes are lost each year due to disrepair. Increasingly, public housing authorities are being pushed by HUD to get rid of their public housing stock altogether, leaving some communities without a critical resource to address their most pressing housing needs. I'm looking forward to hearing more from Ms. Rollins and the rest of the panel as far as your efforts to ensure that families in Wellston and throughout my district are taken care of as the county and HUD determine what to do with public housing properties that require almost $14.5 million in repairs. I also look forward to hearing testimony from our witnesses, who include not only policy experts and government officials, but also HUD tenants who have seen and unfortunately had to live in deplorable living conditions. And I'm hopeful that we will learn from this conversation the ways in which we can ensure that tenants receiving assistance from HUD do not have to live in homes that harm their health and make them sick. And I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Stivers, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Clay. I want to thank you for scheduling this hearing today. I think it's a really important issue that needs examination. Today's hearing will focus on the quality of HUD's housing stock, ranging from properties operated by our public housing authorities to units rented through portable housing choice vouchers. Ensuring Americans occupy homes that are decent, safe, sanitary, and in good repair isn't only a bipartisan goal shared by members of this committee and the entire Congress, it's the law. And it's been the law for decades. But this hearing today, I think, is important to demonstrate the serious shortcomings in the quality of HUD housing, often accompanied by failures of management and always resulting in worse outcomes for residents' health, education, and job prospects. In response, I expect some of my colleagues may focus their attention on the unmet capital improvements that are out there, and I think that is important. I'm the co-chair of the Public Housing Caucus, and I'm not blind to the capital backlog, and I acknowledge that it absolutely deserves examination. But it's probably an oversimplification to argue that that's the only issue here. I think there are a lot of issues. We need to look at the bigger picture. For example, in communities across this country, the supply of housing and rental units is not keeping up with demand. In Franklin County that I represent in Ohio, that shortage is 50,000 units. As a result, many families are spending more of their income on housing, and many relying on housing vouchers may be priced entirely out by this competition, or forced to live in the kinds of poorly maintained properties that we're going to discuss today, and that's wrong. We know that some potential solutions exist, and I wanted to listen for solutions that you might have. But increasing the overall supply and enhancing the low-income housing tax credit is an important option that we absolutely need to look at. Encouraging inclusive zoning and building codes is important, and I think we need to look at what we shouldn't do, and that's things like harmful rent control policies that could actually cause more harm than good. I think we also need to give our public housing authorities greater flexibility to meet the unique needs of their communities and tenants, and encourage creative solutions to the problems they face in their local communities. Our witnesses today will make it clear that the physical characteristics of the housing stock they live in matters. But we should be mindful that federally assisted housing programs should be more than just about putting a roof over somebody's head. It should be about improving outcomes for the residents. That's what I think we need to continue to look forward to. So I look forward to hearing from these witnesses. We want to look for solutions. We are for bipartisan solutions. We share the same goal, Mr. Chairman, and I really appreciate you holding this hearing because HUD is an important tool of our federal government, and I think we need to make sure that HUD is using its resources to help individuals not just get a roof over their head, but climb out of poverty and go on to live their own successful life. And that's what I think we need to work together on, in addition to helping, again, the unmet capital need. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Let me thank the ranking member for his thoughtful opening remark, and I look forward to working with this entire committee to come up with solutions on how we provide decent, safe, affordable housing to all Americans who are in public housing. Thank you. Today we welcome the testimony of Deborah Groh, Deputy Director, National Housing Law Project, Geraldine Collins, Board President, National Alliance of HUD Tenants, and Shalonda Rivers, President and Resident, 22nd Avenue Apartment Tenants Association, Orlando Cabrera, partner of Arnall, Gold & Gregory, and Susan Rollins, Executive Director of the Housing Authority of St. Louis County, and last but not least, Margaret Salazar, Executive Director of Oregon Housing and Community Services Department. Witnesses are reminded that your oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. And Ms. Rollins, you are recognized for 5 minutes to give your oral presentation.
Chairman Clay, Ranking Member Stivers, Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, thank you for this opportunity. The cost of being poor in America is taxing. Often low-income individuals are shuffled into unsafe neighborhoods with high crime rates with dilapidated and vacant buildings. The neighborhoods may be havens for drugs, violence, and crimes. Schools in these neighborhoods struggle with overcrowding, behavioral issues, and accreditation. Many people who live in these neighborhoods suffer from high rates of diabetes, high blood pressure, and other life-threatening diseases. It costs a lot to be poor in America. In the past, public housing has been considered a safety net to help people who are at risk of becoming homeless. Public housing was originally developed in 1937 to house low-income families. But during the 80s and 90s, public housing development began to decline and has since ceased. The decrease in capital funding has led to unaffordability and systematic disrepair. In turn, many housing authorities have begun to demolish and dispose of their public housing stock. Unfortunately, the Housing Authority of St. Louis County is no stranger to this. Housing authorities apply for demolition disposition applications, and the units are demolished because they are inadequate and obsolete. Tenants receive a tenant protection voucher, and many are happy to leave. They move to different neighborhoods, put their children in better school districts. Lately, the Wellston Public Housing Authority has garnered much attention. It's been recommended that the housing stock be demolished and residents be given tenant protection vouchers. Wellston is one of 92 municipalities in St. Louis County. It has 201 units representing approximately 500 individuals, which would require almost $14.5 million to repair. Most of the residents in these units are negatively impacted by the physical conditions and the surrounding environment. During a 2016 report, a former resident discussed her living conditions with researchers, and she cited holes in walls from rodents and severe pest infestation. Her children subsequently acquired asthma and breathing problems and were restricted from playing outside due to the constant gunfire and violence. Like many housing authorities, Wellston is situated in a food desert. In 2016, Washington University researchers found that areas in high-poverty areas are more likely to have fast food, convenience stores, and liquor stores, but few supermarkets and banks. Transportation is another issue. Approximately 20 miles from downtown St. Louis, there was a public housing development called Valley Park. Valley Park had become an oasis because of highways that were built around it. An 18-year-old young resident walked down the median of a 4-lane highway to her Burger King job because there were no bus stops near her, and the express buses did not run at the same time that she needed them. She was terrified of the large trucks that went by her on the highway, but she was determined to do what was best for her family and for herself. Unfortunately, local housing authorities were not brought to the table to discuss transportation, to discuss lack of bus stops, to discuss anything that had to do in getting people from one place to another. So we leave out an entire portion of our community when we're talking about how transportation should be run. Inadequate housing conditions are also found in the Housing Choice Voucher Program. In 2018, TEH, a company, purchased approximately 2,400 units in the St. Louis area and received over $1 million in subsidy payments. In late 2018, the authority inspections noticed a decrease in maintenance. In early 2019, the authority terminated its landlord agreement for any new vouchers. And with a grant from the county, all TEH voucher holders were relocated at no cost to them. Since 2017, Haslick and the St. Louis City Housing Authority have collaborated to offer a mobility program to Housing Choice Voucher tenants. The goal of the program is to help deconcentrate poverty and provide tenants with access to better neighborhoods. It is also shown that the mobility program has a positive effect on health as well. So what do we need? Obviously, more money would be extremely helpful, but as I think Ranking Member Stivers mentioned, that we have to be more creative as well. There need to be dedicated community liaisons joining housing authorities to various governmental departments for a holistic approach to problem solving. HUD needs to be given more autonomy to force multi-jurisdiction vouchers. We need to continue to have demonstration programs like the Uniform Physical Condition Standards for Vouchers that is looking at standardized HQS inspections at a higher level than what is currently in place. In this area, HUD should have autonomy over what might pass as acceptable by local governments. And finally, HUD offices must be staffed with personnel who are proactive and willing to know the faces of the people that we serve and to work with us hand in hand to make sure that we do the best job that we can. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Rollins, for your testimony. Mrs. Salazar, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon. Chairman Clay, Ranking Member Stivers, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to testify on behalf of Oregon Housing and Community Services, OHCS, and the National Council of State Housing Agencies on our shared priority to ensure that federally assisted housing is safe, decent, and affordable for the tenants who rely on it. My name is Margaret Salazar, and I'm Executive Director of Oregon Housing and Community Services. That's Oregon's state housing finance agency. I also have the privilege of serving as the Secretary-Treasurer of NCSHA, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization created by the nation's state housing finance agencies to coordinate and leverage our federal advocacy efforts for affordable housing. State HFAs, such as OHCS, are mission-based, publicly accountable entities created under state law to promote and advance affordable housing in our states and communities. HFAs have our fingers on the pulse of the properties in our multifamily portfolios, including those with HUD financing, through the stewardship, compliance monitoring, and asset management functions that we perform. 33 HFAs, including OHCS, are also Section 8 performance-based contract administrators, known as PBCAs, for HUD's project-based rental assistance portfolio, known as PBRA. We provide direct oversight and monitoring of the regulatory compliance and physical condition of project-based Section 8 properties. As of October 2019, PBCAs administered more. HUD and Congress have recognized that PBCAs are key to HUD's efforts to effectively and efficiently oversee and monitor HUD-assisted properties by reducing improper payments, protecting tenants, and ensuring that properties are well maintained. At the outset, it is important to state that most PBRA properties are in good physical condition and provide tenants with safe, healthy, and affordable homes. Less than 5% of the more than 31,000 PBRA properties are ranked as high risk or troubled. But notwithstanding that, PBCAs are an important touch point for tenants, responding to their concerns in a timely manner and acting as an early warning system for HUD monitoring and enforcement. PBCAs also take proactive approaches to reduce noncompliance with program rules and to leverage our affordable housing resources that we put out as state agencies to improve and preserve the properties in our portfolios. Despite these successes, PBCAs and our portfolios have been impacted by years of program uncertainty as a result of bid protests, funding constraints, inconsistent federal oversight, and HUD's long and complicated process for developing a procurement framework for PBCAs. For example, since 2011, HUD prohibited PBCAs in 42 states from conducting annual management and occupancy reviews, MORs, which are a critical tool for property oversight, while bid protests took place. HUD finally reinstated MORs in 2016. Since then, however, HUD budgetary constraints have limited PBCA reviews to only 43% of the potential reviews each year. The PBCA program now faces a critical juncture as HUD prepares to release a new procurement solicitation that will determine what entities are eligible to service PBCAs, where they can serve, and the scope of their work. We hope that HUD is considering the constructive feedback that it received after its first attempt at procurement to avoid repeating the shortcomings of that attempt. The previously proposed plan failed to comply with statutory requirements that HUD contract with public housing agencies for this important work. HUD also sought to split the work done by PBCAs between regional and national contractors, moving away from a successful, comprehensive, state-based approach. That plan would have added undue risk to the federal government, negatively impacted the health and safety of the 1.2 million tenants who today rely on PBRA assistance, and endangered preservation efforts throughout the country. We urge Congress to protect and improve the PBRA portfolio for those tenants and for future generations by ensuring that HUD's new solicitation for PBCA contracts does not make the same mistakes. And this is why we urge the subcommittee to support the discussion draft's clarification that HUD must contract with public housing agencies for this work and contract with partners that have experience addressing tenant concerns and preserving affordable housing. We want to acknowledge that there are some differences in opinion in the discussion draft and how it approaches this concern. We believe that there is considerable common ground here, and there's consensus available to emphasize the importance of having mission-driven organizations do this PBCA work across the country. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Mrs. Salazar. And now I recognize Ms. Thrope for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Clay, Ranking Member Stivers, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the current state of residents' health and safety in federally assisted housing. I'm here on behalf of the National Housing Law Project, a nonprofit organization that provides legal and technical assistance to housing advocates, tenant leaders, and public officials nationwide on the housing issues confronting poor Americans. Our nation faces an affordable housing crisis. Over 11 million families pay upwards of 50% of their income on rent. HUD housing programs provide an essential source of housing for severely cost-burdened families. In fact, in many communities, HUD housing is the only source of affordable housing for seniors, people with disabilities, and families with children. HUD and Congress must do more to protect the health and safety of these residents. This afternoon, I'll briefly discuss the current state of HUD housing and how we got here, and then I will highlight 5 key recommendations for Congress to improve the quality of life for HUD residents. First, to be clear, as Mrs. Salazar stated in her testimony, a vast majority of HUD-assisted housing is in fact in good condition. According to HUD, 97% of HUD multifamily properties and 92% of public housing properties have physical inspection scores of 60 or higher, which is passing. However, inspection scores don't tell the whole story. The fact is that many HUD tenants are still exposed to mold, lead-based paint, poor air quality, and other health and safety hazards. One reason for this is that HUD's physical inspection protocol, REAC, does not accurately reflect property conditions. REAC inspection standards are dated and have not been modernized to test for common environmental toxins. While we are optimistic that HUD is revising REAC in its new Inspire demonstration, HUD has given us no reason to believe it will address some of our key concerns, notably that residents have been and continue to be denied a role in the inspections process. These concerns were highlighted yesterday in a letter from Representative Waters to Secretary Ben Carson. Another reason we see substandard conditions in HUD housing is because even when HUD does identify deficiency, it rarely holds housing authorities or project-based owners responsible. In most cases, HUD has the tools to enforce physical conditions, but often fails to use them. Finally, in the case of public housing, decades of underfunding by Congress has led to a huge capital need and maintenance repair backlog, close to $50 billion and growing. Rather than managing and rehabilitating its properties, HUD has often failed to address deficiencies and instead focused on demolition. The loss of HUD properties is contributing to our nation's affordable housing crisis. I'll now offer 5 key strategies to address the health and safety of HUD residents. First, Congress must increase funding for the public housing program to address maintenance and repair needs of all existing units. This will help slow the estimated loss of 10,000 public housing units we see each year. While the Rental Assistance Demonstration, or RAD, has provided a path to preserve and rehabilitate a large portion of the public housing stock, RAD is not a viable solution for many housing authorities, especially smaller ones that cannot access the private financing available to meet RAD's bottom line. Bold proposals like Representative Waters' Housing as Infrastructure Act will appropriate sufficient funds to support the development and preservation of public housing. Second, Congress must strengthen HUD's oversight of failing properties. HUD's obligation to create remediation plans and use penalties to bring properties into compliance has weakened with time. Wellston, Missouri, provides an excellent example of how stronger HUD oversight could have preserved HUD housing and protected residents from demoralizing living conditions. I want to highlight one fact that I don't think Ms. Rollins mentioned in her testimony, which is that the Wellston Housing Authority has been in HUD receivership for the past 20 years. During its receivership, HUD completely failed to take steps to rehabilitate the property. Instead, last year, HUD announced the demolition of 200 public housing units, and it doesn't have to be this way. The third strategy is to increase your oversight of HUD. We recommend requiring HUD to submit quarterly reports on detailed property-level information with respect to physical conditions. HUD's current reporting obligations are inadequate to assess the health and safety issues at individual properties. The fourth strategy is to increase resident engagement in the physical inspections process. And you'll hear from Shalonda Rivers in a couple of minutes about how it took the residents themselves to direct HUD's attention to toxic living conditions in her home, despite passing REACT scores. Last, there are several bills up for discussion today that incorporate these strategies. We strongly urge the committee to support H.R. 3745 and the tenant empowerment legislative proposal that was brought here by the National Alliance of HUD Tenants. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Ms. Thrope. And Mrs. Collins, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Hello, and thank you, everyone, for having us here this afternoon. Thank you, Chairman Clay and Ranking Member Stivers, for inviting the National Alliance of HUD Tenants, NAT, to testify on behalf of the 1.7 million households in privately owned HUD housing. We urge Congress to pass the Tenant Empowerment Discussion Draft and to enact the HUD Inspection Act of 2019. Together, these bills will give tools to empower tenants to ensure our homes are safe. Most HUD and public housing provides decent, safe, and affordable homes for millions of families, including Phelps House, where I live in Manhattan. But it has long been apparent to NAT's members that HUD Real Estate Assessment Center systematically underreports health and safety problems. The disconnect between REACT scores and substandard housing came to head at several global ministries' properties in 2015, when tenants at Eureka Gardens in Jacksonville, Florida, exposed deplorable, life-threatening conditions. Most recent coverage by NBC and ProPublica has concluded that REACT is pretty much a failure. HUD has recently instituted the Inspired demonstration in response, but given the urgency, HUD response has been too little, too slow. It shows not have taken action. It takes action of 2 deaths to happen in South Carolina for HUD to realize that tenants were not protected from carbon monoxide. Since 1999, HUD was downsized, and that vision was to organize tenants that could serve as unpaid ears and eyes to save and improve our homes. Unfortunately, from the outset, REACT has rejected this vision and prevented its inspectors from engaging with residents when they visit a property. Management staff can accompany inspectors, but not the people who live in the buildings. If REACT visits during the summer, how will they know that the heating system doesn't work in the winter unless they talk to the tenants? The Tenant Empowerment Bill would address this problem by tapping into experience and expertise of tenants at no cost to taxpayers. Currently, HUD can take action to many owners and have them bring buildings up to code, including partial withholding of Section 8 subsidy buildings. But too often, powerful owners at buildings like Forest Cove in Atlanta are treated with kid gloves by HUD. I have visited Forest Cove, and you'll see some of the slides that's shown here. Although Millennium has managed there for 2 years, tenants are still exposed to deplorable conditions, including rats, water leaks, toxic mold, exposed wiring, and more. No one should have to live like this. We presented these slides to Millennium and HUD last March, urging emergency relocation of 17 families until their units were made habitable. Although the REACT score is 32, HUD has yet to make Millennium take action, and family continues to suffer. The Tenant Empowerment Bill would enable tenants to put out rent into escrow, thereby requiring HUD to withhold its portion of the rent to pressure owners to fix these conditions. If HUD won't move against entrenched, powerful owners, Congress should give the tenants the power to make HUD do its job. The bill would empower tenants of cities to petition HUD or to reinspect properties when REACT failed to detect hazardous condition. For example, St. Edmunds Towers in Chicago, shown in these slides, passed the REACT score in 2017, despite widespread water leaks, mold, asbestos, and window leaks. A maintenance worker was put in intensive care because of a mold that he found behind a child's bedroom. When life-threatening conditions like these persist, the owners and HUD fails to act. The bill would give tenants the right to sue and enforce contracts between HUD and the owner. The bill would also give tenants access to key information such as who the building owners are, their repair plans, reserve overseen by HUD. Tenants can help make sure taxpayers' funds are spent wisely and well. Only slumlords with something to hide would object. This bill would also require REACT to adopt simple, common-sense steps to involve tenants as partners. Because of our homes, tenants have the most at stake. I urge you to pass the tenant empowerment bill so that tenants can partner with HUD to stem the disgraceful blights of substandard housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Collins. Ms. Rivers, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good day, everyone. Chairman Clay, Ranking Member Stivers, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation today. I'm a board member of the National Low Income Housing Coalition and a member of the National Alliance of HUD Tenants. I'm a longtime resident at 22nd Avenue Apartments, Cordova Courts, for 15 years, and currently serve as the president of the Tenant Association. The property is owned by Millennium Housing Management and is subsidized by HUD Project-Based Section 8. The Tenant Association started in 2013 due to the fact of many residents having similar complaints about deplorable conditions and poor management. Realizing many of these deplorable conditions residents faced was not right. We lived in homes with rats, termites, peeling paint, major water leaks, toxic mold, improper security, and plumbing issues that have resulted in raw sewage backing up into our apartments. Some of these issues are documented in the photos that we submitted to the committee today. Deplorable condition still remains today, in spite of many written communications directly to HUD for many years about unsafe and unsanitary conditions. As the president of the Tenant Association, I reached out to HUD in 2015 about the health and safety concerns. HUD was not happy about me contacting them on the behalf of other residents in the community. Many residents in my community was forced to pay out of pocket for mold tests due to HUD response saying no. They cannot send a mold company to do testing. All results showed positive and unsafe levels of mold. In September of 2018, management moved several residents and families, me and my 4 children, out of these toxic, poisonous apartments into hotels while they supposedly made repairs. We spent several holidays in a hotel suite that was not comparable to my 3-bedroom, 1.5 bath apartment. My family checked out of the hotel Tuesday, October the 1st, 2019, a year later. Several residents were forced to move back into a different, unsafe, and unsanitary apartment after living in the hotel for a year. The health and safety of residents are still at risk, forcing residents to face these same old substandard conditions again when apartments were supposed to be fixed. We are forced to live in substandard conditions in spite of written communication to Millennium Management and HUD. I highly believe not one person here today would want their family to endure now or in the future such deplorable conditions. All low-income families should be treated with human dignity and fairness. As a longtime advocate who has been on the grounds advocating for decent, safe, and sanitary housing. However, my family and other families was forced with retaliation evictions from Millennium Housing Management. Additional retaliation came when Millennium abruptly stopped paying for the hotel, forcing low-income residents to pay the hotel fees out of pockets or face homelessness. As of today, with one family, a son with a disability is still living in the hotel, struggling to pay and cover the fees, which management claims there's a legal issue, but this is wrong. Families was displaced because of failures of management. The PBCAs does not work, and HUD failed throughout the years to make sure all residents' homes are decent, safe, and sanitary. One example, May of 2018, REACT for my community, HUD rounded off a final REACT score of 59.54C asterisk to a 60, which they have used as an excuse not to sanction the owner as required by HUD Notice 2018-8. If the tenant empowerment legislation proposed by NAT is passed, this will allow tenants to withhold the tenant's portion of the rent in escrow for units found to be substandard by HUD and withhold HUD larger portion of the rent. This will increase pressure on the property owners and bring owners and HUD to the table. If HUD won't act on its own when buildings are substandard, Congress should give residents the power to make them to do so. If HUD REACT score doesn't reflect actual conditions, this legislation would allow residents to trigger a new inspection with a tenant petition. If HUD take action to enforce its own contracts with owners, this bill will give residents the legal standing to sue enforce these contractors in federal court. This bill will give tenants the power to make owners and HUD do their jobs and provide residents with safe, decent, and affordable housing that we deserve. We ask you to pass this bill. Thank you for the opportunity today to testify.
Thank you, Ms. Rivers, for your testimony. Mr. Cabrera, so good to see you back on Capitol Hill.
Likewise, Mr. Chairman.
You are
Great to see you.
recognized
Good to
for
see all of you.
five minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Stivers and members of the subcommittee for inviting me to testify today. I'm grateful for the opportunity. Mr. Chairman, in the interest of time, I ask that my full oral testimony, which is reduced to writing, be accepted and entered into the record. My immediate concern surrounds the newly released specific discussion draft legislation, not all of it, a particular portion of it. That discussion draft is entitled the Ensuring Performance-Based Contract Administrators Actually Perform Act. That's unfortunately named. It seeks to amend the 1937 Act and potentially harms the mission of providing safe and decent housing. The discussion draft legislation is not helpful because it creates groundwork to impair competition between those entities already federally qualified to act as PBCAs. As Margaret noted, PBCAs are very committed to undertaking their roles as enthusiastically as they always have for 2 decades. This act simply makes that a lot harder and a lot more expensive. The Housing Act of 1937 has, forgive me, I've got these on. PBCAs provide HUD services that help HUD's statutorily mandated mission to serve low-income Americans. Limiting competitors under the 1937 Housing Act would cause competitors to do less, not more. That is, not to serve HUD's mission. The draft legislation is unhelpful for other reasons as well. One of the reasons is that it creates legal issues where none currently exists. The draft creates divisions that are unsupported by law, policy, or decades-old practice. The Housing Act of 1937 has done the heavy lifting of housing low-income Americans for 82 years. Contrary to popular notions, federally assisted housing is a remarkably narrow legal concept that touches millions of lives. Operationally, the 1937 Housing Act's Section 8 program is built upon a legal provision that empowers the Secretary to contract with congressionally determined entities called public housing agencies. The Housing Act of 1937 creates and HUD regulates public housing agencies. Public housing agencies include states, counties, cities, and other governmental entities that engage or assist in the development or operation of public housing, like public housing authorities. Lots of entities engage or assist with the development or operation of public housing. Let's start with public housing agencies that are also public housing authorities. Those are 2 different things. In nearly all states, public housing authorities are creatures of the state, not the federal or local government. They allocate Section 8, operate public housing, or both, as those programs are specifically authorized under the 37 Act. In most states, over 40, state statute governing public housing authorities expressly permit them to enter into contracts, nearly any contract, with the federal government, and in most cases, those laws allow them to contract with HUD specifically in every context. The discussion draft legislation seems to focus its concern on housing finance agencies. What are housing finance agencies? As Margaret noted, housing finance agencies are also created as a matter of state, not federal law. Many, like the one I led, Florida Housing Finance Corporation, as an example, are not state agencies or attached directly to the state government. And unlike public housing authorities that HUD itself has pronounced as capable of acting as PBCAs, HUD has made no similar express determination that HFAs are necessarily instrumentalities of their state. Unlike public housing authorities, housing finance agencies do not own or develop public housing. In fact, most neither own public housing nor administer Section 8, which again is not public housing. So in all other relevant respects, the concerns that the draft legislation seeks to clarify seem to apply to any government agency that is a public housing authority, housing finance agency, or other governmental entity, like a county or city housing department. So that begs the question, why does the draft legislation only mention public housing agencies that are HFAs? I think it's designed to do a couple of things. It's designed to address a problem that's not fundamentally there. And it's designed to make sure that, I think it's designed to make sure, I'm not sure as it's a discussion draft, that somehow those things that have not been clear in the past become clear now. It accomplished exactly the opposite of that. Now, just for the record, there are people out there who think that HFAs are not public housing agencies. I am not one of those people. I led an HFA. I have been on NCSHA's board. So I am not in that school. I do think there's a better way to approach this. Margaret rightly noted that HUD has had an uneven record with respect to procurement, which I'm happy to talk about as I was heavily involved in all of that. But it seems to me that the right way to proceed might be to have an agreement that the Housing Act says certain things. One of the things it says is public housing agencies administer project-based Section 8. Maybe we can begin there. Thank you for your time. I'm ready to answer all of your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Cabrera, for your time. And now we will begin the 5 minutes of questions. And I'll start with my questions. Ms. Rollins, recently we had a situation in St. Louis where a tenant had cockroaches in her apartment, which turned out to be an infestation. Despite the efforts of the St. Louis City Housing Authority, and unfortunately she had to live in her car for a short period of time. Can you talk about the cooperation that was necessary to ensure that all fellow St. Louisans that our fellow St. Louis and her children had a safe place to live?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing up that example. The City Housing Authority has thousands of public housing units. The St. Louis County Housing Authority, now that we've absorbed Wellston, has about 501 public housing units. But regardless, there should never be a situation where a family is put in that type of situation. I think that Ms. Rivers spoke, Ms. Collins, I'm sorry, spoke very eloquently to that. There should never be in a situation where a family is paying for their relocation or for being in a unit that is not up to par. I was very sad to see the City Housing Authority take so long to pay attention to this particular situation, and it took many, including your office, to get them to pay attention to this situation. I would like to hope that all housing authority directors or all people who are responsible for the people that we serve would take an interest and get out into the field and find out what's going on in those communities. I tend to be that type of director. I'm out of the office much more than I'm in the office, and I think it's important, even when I send my staff into the trenches, that I go with them. But not everybody feels that way, not everybody believes that, so it's important for us to have some rules in place that we can be assured that everybody's getting, that we're at the same level of looking at things and that we're in the same level at dealing with situations. I would hope that if the Wellston Housing Authority had been under our purview a long time ago, this wouldn't be where we are today. So those are some of the issues. I agree with the issues as well about housing authorities, about HUD and the REAC inspections and not feeling that they are strong enough, because when I go into a unit, I'm looking at a unit in terms of whether I would live there myself or whether I would have any of my family members live there. The housing, I'm sorry.
Let me ask Mrs. Salazar, not to cut you off, but Mrs. Salazar, a March 2019 report from the GAO paints a picture of an overwhelmed and under-resourced real estate assessment center, REAC, the part of HUD responsible for inspections of public and multifamily housing. We also know that HUD lost almost 50% of its staff since 1991 and almost 20% between 2008 and 2017, more than any other cabinet-level department during this time. If these levels of staff loss and resource depletion continue at HUD, what will be the effect of the department's ability to ensure the availability of safe and decent housing for low-income Americans?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for that question. I think we're definitely concerned about the overall capacity of being able to ensure the oversight of the HUD-assisted portfolio. Our role as the performance-based contract administrator is that we engage on behalf of HUD with providing the oversight for these properties. So I think as HUD's staffing levels have diminished and capacity has diminished, it's even more important that we have mission-driven agencies, such as public housing agencies that are on the ground working with these properties to be able to respond. And I'll give you one quick example of that. We have a tenant hotline, and we responded with a tenant complaint that they had no hot water in their unit. We raised that concern to the owner. The owner did not correct the issue. We raised it to HUD, and we recommended that HUD abate the Section 8 payment for that apartment. HUD followed our recommendation and abated the Section 8 until the repair was able to be made. And it's only because of the relationship that we have that we were able to do that. But without a robust PBCA program, that relationship is in jeopardy.
Thank you. Mrs. Collins, tell me what you think the weaknesses are in the HUD inspection program. What did you witness? Turn on your mic for us, please. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. The weakness there is that HUD, that has given HUD many recommendations on how to better help them do this. But I see the situation, I understand the problem that they don't have enough people to take care of the plans, but I think that had they done stuff in the beginning, it would not have gotten this bad. And that's why we urge you today to pass the tenant empowerment bill to force HUD to do better, because they could have and they didn't.
Thank you. And the gentleman from Ohio is recognized, Mr. Stiver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you again for holding this hearing. It's a very important topic, and we need to make sure that people are in safe and decent housing. And I want to thank all the witnesses for being here. Mr. Cabrera, welcome back to the committee. I think you have a unique insight as somebody who's formerly worked at HUD and now a housing developer and provider. In past testimony, you've talked about how HUD is woefully inadequate, both in the technology at their disposal and the data collection and data use they have to improve conditions and to improve outcomes. Do you believe this contributes to the quality of housing stock that is either unsafe or not decent?
It does. I think that contributes in a couple of ways. The first one is just with respect to REAC inspections. Being the guy who principally was responsible for REAC oversight at one point, the data that is being collected using methodologies that are 30 years old. HUD, in some areas, still uses Excel spreadsheets to collect data. That's a significant problem. It means that they can't relate.
I did that in college in the 90s.
Yeah, bad circumstances, as my colleagues to the right have recounted, to any kind of correlation.
Not very good follow-up there, and not a very good tickler system, and not a very good way to keep that data.
Yeah, but in part, if I might, Ranking Member, that is not entirely a HUD thing. That is going to be an institutional decision, not HUD's institutional decision, but this body's institutional position to invest in data collection and invest in the technology. And I'm not casting.
If we were to do that, do you believe that could be used to not only track the quality of housing stock, but also track outcomes of residents and improve outcomes of residents?
It would improve things soup to nuts from HUD's perspective, from each PBCA's perspective, and from the residents' perspective, and the owners, by the way.
Thank you. One more for you, Mr. Kerr. We hear a lot about the rising cost of rental units. I hear a lot about that in my district. We have a shortage of supply, which results in higher cost and more competition. Do you think that is also making it harder for users of choice vouchers to get access to homes?
I think it depends upon where it is. In some places where rent is far outpacing payment standards, it's becoming a crisis. It is a crisis. In other places, it's less so. It's not a uniform rule. I have two hometowns. I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, and in Miami, Florida. And in both places, it is in crisis mode at this point. So it depends.
Yeah, and I understand that market conditions matter, but in many areas, I think that is a driving part of the problem, and something we need to look at as a broader policy issue. Ms. Rollins, thank you for being here. I really appreciated your testimony. Can you tell me, do you feel like HUD gives your PHA the flexibility you need to meet the unique challenges in your community?
I think flexibility is the wrong word, really,
Okay.
when we're talking about this. It's very difficult to work with some of the HUD offices and also to work with all of the rules that are in place.
Help me rephrase that then. Are the rules stifling to your ability to serve your community, and is there a way to make HUD help be a better partner in serving the population you serve? How's that?
That's much better, and
Thank
the
you.
answer is yes. Every community is different. You just heard that from Mr. Cabrera. Things are different no matter where you are, and I think that we have to take that into consideration. And local HUD offices have to understand our communities that we're working in. You also have state government that's working with us or against us, and you have local government that's working with us or against us as well. And we have to understand all of those pieces of the puzzle before we can really work at a problem and get down to where we can solve something.
And I only have 35 seconds left. One last one for you, Ms. Rollins. Moving to work, does that give you better flexibility? Does that help you serve your community better, yes or no? And if you want to expand in 23 seconds, you can.
It's not something that we've used in the Housing Authority of St. Louis County. It has not been as effective as what we would like for it to see there, but it can be used in other communities, I think, very well. So demonstration programs are important, and we need to look at all of the options for all of the communities.
If you have other ideas to help them, make them a better partner, please follow up with us, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. And I want to recognize the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Velasquez, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Thrope, public housing in our nation is in a state of crisis. And, you put a face into what's going on in the public housing developments where you live in, Mrs. Collins and so many others. So despite the deteriorating conditions of our public housing system and the detrimental impact it is having on residents' health, for the second year in a row, President Trump and Secretary Carson requested $0 for HUD's Public Housing Capital Fund for FY 2020, which is the main source of funding public housing authorities relied on to address necessary infrastructure upgrades, such as roof, boilers, and piping. Can you explain the impact zeroing out the capital fund will have on the conditions in public housing?
Thank you, Representative Velasquez. So the failure to fund public housing has had an incredible impact on public housing residents around the country, and it's led to deteriorating conditions for many families. And public housing plays a critical role, as Representative Velasquez stated, in many communities. It's often the only form of deeply affordable housing for families because it's an income-based rent. And so it's all the more important that we put the resources into preserve it. And I want to note, when we don't preserve public housing, when we fail to fund public housing, HUD's response historically has been to demolish it. Mm-hmm. And when we demolish public housing, what happens is we do something called voucher the tenants out, which we give families vouchers. And many communities around this country cannot absorb the vouchers, as we were just discussing, when we voucher out these public housing residents. And so that itself is contributing to the affordable housing crisis. And there's examples all over the country where the voucher markets just can't absorb the vouchers as a result of demolitions, and families are displaced.
Thank you. And as a result of that, I introduced legislation, H.R. 4546, the Public Housing Emergency Response Act, which will authorize $70 billion for the Public Housing Capital Fund and address all the capital repair needs of all public housing authorities around the country, Are you supportive of a funding infusion of this kind? And how would it improve the living conditions and health needs of residents?
Great. So we would support any increase in funding for the public housing programs due to the severe capital needs at many properties, as well as the maintenance repair backlog. So any infusion of funding could significantly positively impact the lives of public housing residents.
And it could happen, I don't know, I don't think that it will happen this year, but if there is consensus and bipartisan support, is in passing an infrastructure bill calling for trillions of dollars of investment. And what I've been advocating for is to treat public housing as part of our national infrastructure. And I hope that you will all be supportive of such an effort.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentlewoman for a question. I want to go to the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Lukenmeyer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And listening to the commentary and their testimony up to now, it's a summary would be that there's a shortage of public housing and that existing housing stock is in definite need of repair. And some of the other things that have been said, that there's a shortage of money to be able to do all these things, that we've got problems with HUD inspectors, and we've got owner problems, being able to get owners to live up to the agreements to take care of their property. So it's a multifaceted problem that we're talking about, and I appreciate all your commentary today. I think it's important we get the full picture. Let me start with Mr. Cabrera. As we've heard today, public housing capital funds face a shortfall of up to $70 billion. HUD's Rental Assistance Demonstration Project, RAD, was created under the Obama administration in 2011 to preserve and maintain affordable housing. RAD gives public housing authorities the ability to convert public housing into long-term project-based assistance while leveraging public and private debt and equity. Do you think RAD has been successful in meeting its goal of preserving affordable housing?
I think RAD's been indispensable to converting and preserving affordable housing. I think that the idea that RAD somehow harms communities is something I just haven't experienced. I have seen housing authorities transformed, and I've seen tenants' lives transformed through RAD. RAD assures affordability for a period, generally for decades, for between 35 and 50 years, depending upon what state you're in. And I think that, candidly, RAD would move more effectively if housing authorities didn't have to incur a significant financial hit when they undertake a RAD deal, because what's happening is you're losing public housing stock and you're increasing either project-based vouchers or HAP contracts, but it impacts their bottom line severely, and they have to transition operations. Many housing authorities struggle with that, which is why they're not undertaking RAD. Just a couple of great examples. Congresswoman Velasquez-Lev, NYCHA has had a really hard time with RAD just simply because of scale and expense. So I guess I'm beating this horse, but the answer is yes, Congressman.
Love the answer. We got a lot of explanation there. Thank you for that. In light of this massive shortfall in capital funds that we've been talking about here, what other options are available to help preserve our housing stock?
Is that for me as well?
Yes.
I am deeply concerned that the capital fund is in constant crisis. I don't know that there's a $50 billion shortfall in capital needs in public housing. Here's what I can affirmatively say as a matter of affirmed metrics. It's above $36 billion. We know that. I think that I do not have the expectation, just generally as a matter of budget reality, that Congress would appropriate something on the order of $36 or $50 billion for purposes of revisiting public housing. I think trying to leverage those mechanisms that exist currently to the fullest extent possible is a critical thing. So, for example, currently, Senator Cantwell, and I can't remember the co-sponsor, Garth, give me a help. Who's the co-sponsor? Young, thank you. There you go, Senator Todd Young from Indiana, have a bill that expands the low-income housing tax credit, and that would be a very good thing for public housing authorities looking to revisit their assets, because public housing authorities, when they compete within 9% cycles, a particular kind of low-income housing tax credit, they're competing with the entire marketplace. And if you don't expand that pool, it's going to be harder and harder for them to win very scarce resources. So I would encourage that kind of thinking.
I know we've talked about this many times, and there's always been a problem with the shortage of units, and one of the things is always the rules and regulations, the local ordinances, and the cost that the contractor incurs. Do you think if we had, with the low-income housing tax credit program, if you had some waivers attached to that for some of the regulations, the local stuff that just add cost upon cost upon cost to these projects, it'd be helpful of some kind, or we could, or find a way to put waivers on there, or what would be your suggestion? Because this is ridiculous, that 25% of the cost of one of our hearings one time was due to regulation.
Right. I was a developer for a company that was based in Southern California that developed in California and in other states. And soft costs, which is what you're referring to, was an enormous carry in the context of all of our deals. How do you reduce that? That's probably as complex a question as I can think of in places like California, because there are so many other laws, state laws and regulations that come into play. It's hard to answer that question simply for that reason. So in California, can it be reduced? The answer is yes. It can.
But it does come into play with regards to getting housing to be affordable.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, sir.
I now go to the chairwoman of the committee, Chairwoman Waters from the state of California.
Thank you so much, Congressman Clay, for holding this hearing. And I want to thank you for all of the work that you're doing relative to your area, St. Louis, Missouri, and your focus on Wellston and all that you're attempting to accomplish to make sure that that HUD is providing the resources and doing what can be done for revitalization and providing opportunities for tenants. But more than that, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you because you have here before you today Ms. Geraldine Collins, the board president of the National Alliance of HUD Tenants. And I met with them a few months back to talk about how Congress and HUD can help ensure that tenants are empowered to hold their landlords and the agency accountable when it comes to conditions in housing that no one should have to live in. Now, and I can't tell you how pleased I am about their advocacy, because oftentimes we accuse tenants of not being involved, not speaking up for themselves, and now we hear a real voice and real advocacy and organizing. However, they're doing it without the support of HUD. And HUD has, as I understand it, $10 million that should be directed toward helping tenants to organize. And so the question becomes, and I guess I just want to get this on the record for Ms. Collins, has HUD made any attempt to talk about how they're going to release the resources that should be available to tenants to help in this organizing effort?
No, they haven't. Thank you for that question. No, they haven't. We've met with them several times, not several times, months after months, year after year, and they have never given us an answer.
And so they have not given you an answer about resources, and you're out there working, using your own resources to organize and to get people together and travel and all of that. And at the same time, HUD is not, as I understand it, living up to its responsibility for repair and for the upkeep of the housing that it has the oversight and management for. Is that correct?
That's correct. They can bring down to $10 million a year annually. And all they need to do is to put out to different areas in the different states $1 million to help tenant association organize. If they put that money out there, tenants would be able to be organized, whereas right now we had vistas. Whereas if we did not have the VISTA program the last 4 years, a lot of people would have lost their homes.
This inspired demonstration, What is that all about? Is that about inspections, and what is happening with that?
It's another gimmick that HUD has come up with. And I say that to say this because the new Inspire model, it gives the owner the opportunity to self-inspect. And we're against the self-inspection because there is no number, it's not counted. When they self-inspect, now they're inspecting units from 30% to 50%. We don't understand the logistics of what they're trying to do. It's like all the recommendation that Nat has given them over the years, only one they have honored, and that was the civil monetary penalty, which they still haven't honored. They gave a property in Trinity in Texas. They gave them a civil monetary penalty, but then they took it back.
Well, let me just tell you that I have met with Ms. Presley and I've met with Ms. Tlaib, and we know that you're contemplating possible legislation, and
Yes.
if this legislation is introduced and we work on it, it would be tough. It will deal with the issue, and so we're going to meet again.
Yes.
We have a meeting that's being planned in December where we will meet with the nonprofits who have Section 8 housing or HUD housing or what have you. And so Ms. Tlaib and Ms. Presley and I are focused on this, and we're with you. Thank you.
thank
I
you
yield
for
back
that.
the balance of my time.
Thank you.
And I thank the chairwoman for her questions and pointing out that tenants do have rights. I appreciate that. At this time, we recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Tipton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate all of the panel taking the time to be able to be here. Obviously, housing in all of our areas for all residents is something that's critically important. I'd like to be able to maybe expand a little bit of the conversation because the focus seems to be an awful lot in urban areas, which I do not discount in the least. But I happen to represent rural America, where we do have housing issues as well in terms of being able to be addressed. And Ms. Collins, in response to the chairwoman's question in regards to Inspire program, wanted to follow up on that a little bit with you, Mr. Cabrera. In regards to the program, it's been updated to, with the intent of being able to improve inspections, to know where maintenance issues arise. And as a former Secretary for Public Housing, what reforms should the inspection process take into account, especially when it applies to rural America?
I think Inspire needs some meat on the bones. I think one of the problems that both HUD and the stakeholder community has, including my colleagues to the right, is it seems a little bit rudderless right now. It would help to have a rudder. It would help rural America as much as it would urban. I remind people all the time, Section 8 and public housing are indispensable to rural America. They are not just urban products. It's really amazing, but the two states with the largest number of counties are Texas and Georgia. And those counties all have public housing authorities, and they are generally small. They're generally fewer than 15 or 20 units. And it's important that they get some guidance with respect to how it is this will all work. And I think the other thing is they just have to figure out a way for people to have a remedy in the event that there is an adverse decision. So if someone disagrees, they have to have a place to go.
Right. You know, we've had testimony in regards to having tenant participation. In terms of developing that rudder, that outreach, who else should HUD reach out to?
That's a very big group, Congressman. You know, owners are an indispensable part of that conversation. I read the legislation, the draft discussion legislation. Congressman Lawson's bill has a lot in it that is very worthwhile to discuss, and then there's a lot that I can tell you affirmatively stakeholders will have significant commentary upon. Given that it's the first step in the process, it's a hard question to answer.
Okay. And we'd had the comments in terms of some of the self-inspection. Wanted to be able to maybe get your sense a little bit, given the territory that I represent. We have 54,000 square miles of Colorado. For the most part, there's no easy way to be able to get from here to there without going over 3 mountain passes to be able to get into those areas. Are there some benefits to some self-inspection that we might be able to employ, particularly in the rural areas?
So self-inspection is used in other facets of ownership that don't have to do with affordable housing, but they always come up with, or they always come with some other mechanism to assure the accuracy of the inspection. That would be helpful. The other thing to keep in mind is it's not always just self-inspection. Generally, there is a planning and zoning or building department involved for some jurisdiction, a county, a city, if it is in fact an incorporated city. And having coordination with those codes is important as well. Most of federal inspection criteria depends heavily upon what either local codes say or state codes say. It is not entirely or even mostly a federal question. And so much of that has to do with how you articulate that and what we mean by self-inspection. I can easily see the other side of that coin, which is to say, if I were a tenant and it would be entirely ownership that is inspecting, that would cause me incredible stress. But I don't think that that's what anybody has in mind.
Okay. And really appreciated my colleague, Mr. Luchtmeyer, kind of encapsulating the variety of challenges, again, that you just alluded to in terms of some of the costs that are associated with developing affordable housing in a lot of our resort communities, particularly based off of tourism. They hadn't really even planned, had any kind of a plan to be able to develop it. Could some of the maintenance issues actually maybe help some of that dilemma that we face in those areas?
Yeah, I think they are suffering from the same challenges as public housing authorities with capital need generally. And when it comes to a lot of those housing units in your area of Colorado, which I'm tacitly familiar with, I will say that some of those units are low-income housing tax credit units, and they work under a different regimen.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. And I want to now recognize the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, who is also the chair for the Subcommittee on National Security, International Development, and Monetary Policy for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. About 10 years ago, directors, initially you, Ms. Rollins, about 10 years ago, I was with a group in London, and while there we decided to try to meet with London, what would be comparable to the housing department of London, mainly in what's called Old London. And one of the places we received a lot of information on was a 24-story tower called Grenfell. And so I'm here in Washington, in my little apartment across the street, and in June of 2017, and I'm looking at the news, and all of a sudden they show this fire at the Grenfell Towers. And if you haven't seen it, you ought to pull it up. It just looks like, I mean, you would wonder how anybody got it alive. And to be sure, 70 people died in that fire. And even today, there's argument over what caused it. Somebody cyanide something, and electrical fire with a freezer, all kinds of things. But even while I was back here, I got angry about it because I used to live in public housing. I'm just thinking, you know, I wonder if there were ongoing inspections, and maybe more significantly, when I bring it home, I wonder, are there standardized inspections? And wouldn't we be better off if we, I mean, look, I've lived in public housing, self-inspection, all that stuff. I'm talking experientially, you know, no sociological book. I'm talking about living there. We need standardized, I'm sorry, do you think we need to have standardized inspections?
We have to have some standard in inspections. In St. Louis, I mentioned we have 92 municipalities. So you have unincorporated St. Louis County doing inspections. You have other communities doing inspections, and no one's doing it the same way. In the city of Wellston, there was so much confusion, collusion, whatever we'd like to call it. An inspection was done, but it was never done, but it was paid for by the housing authority. And that's a crime. And we have to have standardized inspections that make sense and that everybody can be on the same page with. We also have opportunities for ordinances that say if a private owner develops a building, as it, for instance, TEH, and they're condemned, TEH buildings were condemned, that company should pay for the relocation for those individuals. So I think there are ways to work through these issues with standardized inspections, with ordinances that put the responsibility back on the owner. And I would just like to make a comment in regard to the cost of doing housing. I also think that some of the astronomical developer fees that are being taken in today's environment are also very negative as well. But I would say we definitely need a standard that makes sense for inspections.
All right, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield back. I would encourage anybody, particularly my colleagues, if you get a chance tonight to look up that fire online, and it will remind you of 9/11, the way that building is just completely destroyed. And I keep wondering, can that happen here? And the sound I get is a resounding yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman. Now, the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Kuffstoff, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for convening today's hearing, and thanks to the witnesses for appearing this afternoon. Mr. Cabrera, with your experience at HUD, can you talk to us about the rental assistance demonstration, the effectiveness over the last 6 or 7 years since its creation? I guess in essence, do you think it's met its goal of preserving affordable housing?
I think it's met its goal of preserving affordable housing, and I think it's met its goal of creating units that better serve its communities and its residents.
Are there other ways that Congress could be looking at more ways to include private sector funding for public housing?
Well, for one, the Cantwell-Young bill in the Senate would, a corollary in the House would be terrific. The tools that we now use to develop affordable housing do not necessarily emanate from HUD. They emanate from the Internal Revenue Code, specifically Section 42 and Section 143. And so at the end of the day, leveraging those mechanisms, which really invite private investment, is important. RAD works mostly because it allows a housing authority that applies for a version of something called a disposition, a conversion from Section 9, which is public housing, to some form of Section 8. So it's either going to be project-based vouchers for a term of 20 years, or it's going to be a HAP contract. And that makes it financially supportable to do the deals. So much of affordable housing has to do with whether a particular discrete transaction pencils out, whether it makes financial sense, not in 1 year, but over the entire life of the development. RAD makes that possible for purposes of all of these conversions.
In the questioning from Ranking Member Stivers, you talked about technology and the technology being outdated. You talked specifically about still using Excel. That's one issue. Is employee turnover also an issue, and if so, to what effect? And I mean turnover at HUD.
It is not just an issue. It is an enterprise-wide, and I mean federal crisis, but particularly acute at HUD. So when I was at HUD, as I recall, we had a total of 8,800 employees. Approximately 40% of those folks worked in my world. That went up to 9,300 employees between 2008 and 2016 for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is the aging of the federal workforce. We're down to 7,800, perhaps 7,700 employees at HUD. And as I commonly say when this comes up in the conference setting, when I was in office, fully 12 years since I've resigned come January, when I was in office, 60% of HUD was qualified to retire. That number's only gone up. So part of the issue here with HUD is it is suffering through the weight of a lack of physical capacity within its personnel pool.
Thank you. If I could, one last area, and that's as it relates to lead hazards in housing. Can you talk about the progress that HUD has made, maybe since your time at HUD to now, what progress has been made and what you've seen?
You know, one of the unwritten success stories, however uneven the successes have been federal efforts in lead-based paint remediation. That history begins in 1973 and it progresses in 1978. And what it actually caused was in a single-family home setting and in a multifamily home setting, assuring that either you receive notice that there is a lead-based paint problem, or if it's acute enough and it's a property prior to January 1 of '78, you remedy it. It succeeded particularly well with public housing because most public housing units were constructed between 1937 and 1984. The only asterisk, the Roger Maris asterisk to that answer is, as we've recently learned in the last 18 months, public housing authorities, not authorities plural, but there have been incidences here and there, spot incidences, where certain authorities have misrepresented their compliance with lead-based paint remediation. That is a problem. It is a significant problem. I don't put that on the HUD pile. I put that on the Public Housing Authority pile, and I don't include Ms. Rollins.
Thank you. You're back.
Thank you. And we now go to the gentleman from Florida. Mr. Lawson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I would like to welcome you all to the committee. And I really appreciate the work that you all do out there. My father-in-law was involved in a government housing facility along with another university professor. And they used to spend an inordinate amount of time taking care of the facilities and providing activities and so forth for the youth. And I myself, from being a college coach and playing a little bit of professional ball, I used to go into the facilities during the summer months and set up programs just for kids to have something to do on the playgrounds and so forth, and so I know the work. But what has really bothered me in recent years, because I spent a lot of time in these facilities, is really incomprehensible at the way that HUD has responded to these organizations that have taken over most of these housing complexes. For instance, and I'll just tell you that one of the residential facilities, Eureka Garden, Valencia Way in Jacksonville, has suffered immensely from several years due to mismanagement and unsafe living conditions, including mold, sewer, all the other things that go along with them. And recently, because of a gas outage, many of them have had to have food brought in because they weren't able to cook on facilities. And then at the same time, which was very alarming, in order for them to have hot showers, a bath for their kids, they had to go into the parking lot, with trailers and stuff there, which I really thought was very unhumane for them to have to do that, especially women and stuff, early in the morning before they get ready to go to work. And so I have sponsored H.R. 2745, the HUD Inspection Act, that would strengthen the HUD inspection process, providing more oversight and transparency. It almost seemed like there's a war going on between HUD and these housing facilities. I've had the secretary down in the Jacksonville area to review some of the conditions and so forth that is taking place, and they'll say that I'm working on them, you know, and this has been 3.5 years later, but they're still working on them. It is unfortunate that you would even see a secretary propose cutting millions of dollars from oversight and for these facilities, looking at what exists, and you're actually wondering who are they working for. You know, are they really trying to help people really in these facilities have a quality of life that all of them should have, because the government is not broke. And the government have, as if they don't pay any attention to what is we send them from Congress. But what they do is they're trying to save money on the very poor people who are struggling to keep a roof over their head and provide for their families. And a lot of these individuals that they are dealing with are women with kids, single heads of households, working, doing the very best that they can. And I know it sounds more like a dissertation for most of you, because you all see what happened in these inner cities and so forth. My question is, in your relationship, and I don't have much time, and I'll just start off, Ms. Rollins might not get any further, in your relationship with HUD and bringing these dilapidated conditions before them, what takes them in another direction instead of trying to help people in need?
I don't think that HUD sometimes has the mindset to really focus on what needs to happen. We're in the trenches by ourselves. As you say, it's taken 3.5 years to really accomplish nothing. And since I've been at the Housing Authority for 11 years, I faced the same situation. I'm not sure why. I think it's very easy to not be involved and to not care when you're not there. And it's easy to put all of this responsibility on the backs, as you say, and that's so correctly put, of our tenants. So there has to be a way for Congress to make HUD step up to the table and step up to the plate and do what they need to do for the residents that we're involved with. You shouldn't have to live the way we're living with these clients currently. It is abysmal what we're going through. There shouldn't be a Wellston. There shouldn't be any of the localities that we've been talking about so far. So we really have to put the onus on HUD to make a difference.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now go to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rose, who's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Clay and Ranking Member Stivers, for holding this hearing. I may be going out on a limb here, but I think we can all agree that when it comes to HUD-assisted housing, we want residents to live in housing that is safe, decent, and sanitary. But just to be safe, I'd like to start off by asking for a show of hands from the witnesses here today. Who here believes that every resident in HUD-assisted properties should live in housing that is safe, decent, and sanitary? Show of hands, please. Great. We're off to a good start. When it comes to taxpayer dollars, we have a responsibility to ensure that every dollar spent by the federal government is used wisely, efficiently, and for its intended purpose. Too often, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle claim that the answer to mismanaged federal programs is providing more funding, more inputs. Yesterday, the Washington Post reported on a federal program, the Hub Zone program, that actually funneled hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars into Washington, D.C.'s richest neighborhoods at the expense of poorer areas because of the program was using unadjusted and outdated data for years. Throwing more money at a problem doesn't solve the underlying problem. If there's a problem with the program's outcome, maybe, just maybe, it's because we in Congress have neglected our oversight responsibilities as they relate to the funds we've already appropriated. The answer is also not a total government takeover of local problems. Just yesterday, the House voted on and passed another continuing resolution instead of a full funding bill for fiscal year 2020 because Congress can't agree to get that job done in a timely manner. We haven't even passed a bill to fully fund our military for fiscal year 2020, one of the most basic constitutional responsibilities of the Congress. Yet there are some who make the case that the federal government needs more on its plate. I disagree. There are bipartisan programs that have provided affordable housing to millions of Americans, and we should look at what can be done to strengthen and possibly expand these programs. For instance, between 1986, when the low-income housing tax credit was first enacted, and 2013, more than 13.3 million people lived in homes financed by the LIHTC housing credit. I know that in Tennessee, the Tennessee Housing Development Agency has benefited from and supports this program. The LIHTC overall has helped build or rehabilitate more than 3.2 million affordable housing units, leveraging more than $190 billion in private investment to do so. Mr. Cabrera, should policymakers change their thinking about how assisted housing in America works? Should we do more to encourage private investment in the production and preservation of affordable housing?
If markets do the work they can do with a private-public partnership, it works best. And if that's the case, that would include RAD conversions, that would include LIHTC, that would include private activity bonds with a version of LIHTC called the 4% LIHTC. And that would include, candidly, the HUD budget. So much more can be done if you let folks do it. We always will get the bad story. The question is to always work toward solving the bad story, but remembering there are a lot of good stories, and you just mentioned a huge one, which is roughly 13 million residents live in LIHTC units now after 33, well actually technically 31 years. So at the end of the day, yeah, they do it quicker, they do it better, and they do it less expensively. That is not to say that public housing does not have a place. In some places, public housing is the only recourse. It has to be preserved. 25% of public housing residents right now are elderly people. Another 18%, as I recall, I might be a bit off, are disabled. That's an important thing to remember. A good many of public housing residents that have single-parent households rely on the public housing. It is very difficult for me to conceive of a world without some form of public housing.
Thank you. And I just hope that as we look at this issue, we don't just seek to measure inputs, but that we search for ways to measure outcomes. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. And just to point out to my friend from Tennessee, the article that you cited today was a program administered by the Small Business Administration called Hub Zones, who relied on faulty data from HUD. So, just for clarification for everybody to know. At this time, I want to recognize a gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairman. Thank you all so much for being here and your incredible advocacy to protect a lot of my neighbors at home that are renters and that depend on quality housing. There's a number of changes that have been made, I think, currently with HUD. One that I'm very concerned about and just want to put it in the record is the changing and removing disparate impact as a way to show housing discrimination within HUD. I know I've submitted comments and very concerned about Dr. Carson and this administration's move to try to make it impossible for people to prove housing discrimination. The other is HUD's move away from their current mission statement, and they're removing words like pushing to meet the need for quality, affordable rental homes. They want to remove that from the mission statement. They also want to remove from the mission statement, utilize housing as a platform for improving quality of life. Again, very concerned in that move. I also, Mr. Chairman, would like to submit for the record an article that is titled, Under Ben Carson, More Families Live in HUD Housing That Fails Health and Safety Inspections, right here. And since 2016, we've actually seen 30% increase.
Without objection.
Thank you. 30% increase in HUD properties failing inspections, and that's more than 1,000 properties. Not only missing smoke detectors, but other life-threatening issues regarding the inspection. And so I want to talk a little bit about my district. There was a constituent that I could not believe this, but she said, right now, we're working with a constituent whose building has been infested with bed bugs 9 times. The building is operated by HUD. Bed bugs have developed a resistance that makes them almost impossible to kill, very difficult to kill, but very expensive. Recently, Detroit was actually named the 5th most active city for bed bug activity, noting that bed bugs have been popping up with greater regular kind of patterns in public housing. And it's very alarming that HUD's current physical inspection protocol hasn't evolved since adoption 21 years ago. And that is alone, just 21 years ago, we haven't adopted. And so, Ms. Rivers, what flaws do you see currently in HUD's Real Estate Assessment Center, especially when it comes to bed bug infestation, as I previously described?
One of the flaws that I see for myself as a president for the Tenant Association is not allowing the tenants to participate in the REACT inspections. If they allowed the tenants to participate in it, such as for my community that I know, we have a lot of toxic mold, a lot of rats, infestation of roaches, we will be able to point these things out. So that is a major flaw that I see in reference to the REACT.
You talked a little bit about like having the residents' involvement. And I know I'm going to be working with Chairwoman Waters as well as my colleague from Massachusetts, Representative Presley, about having more support and capacity support for our tenants associations that really help us hold a lot of folks accountable, including HUD and other folks that are involved in making sure there's quality. But what would that look like to actually have tenants be involved in shaping what the Real Estate Assessment Center would do?
It will allow the tenants to do a petition to trigger an inspection. So as organizing, as working together in the community is doing petitions, that is one way.
So basically a way to form the federal government that there is a problem here.
Correct, and it would trigger a inspection, a REACT.
So the complaint system online doesn't work?
It does not work. I've been doing it for years after months after month. The PBCAs are a waste of residents' time. Contacting the protocol that HUD wants the residents to go through, it's a waste of time. It is a waste of time. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, and there's a lack of urgency when folks submit, yeah.
Yes.
The question for Ms. Collins, thank you so much for being here. I know there was some like tenant survey that happened and about, kind of a sample like real estate assessment center for inspected properties. What were you guys were trying to address there? What was included in the survey and what was effective in addressing some of the concerns of the residents that you heard?
We were trying to bring back the tenant survey for the simple reason that some of the issues that Shalonda just mentioned, the tenant association would be able to come along with the REACT inspector and inspect the apartment along with this person that was inspecting, because the tenants are the one that live there. So they know exactly what's going on in the building instead of doing different things that HUD wants us to do. And another thing, the survey would also keep the owners accountable and not let them get away with saying, we did this and we did that. Whereas the tenants themselves live there, and the residents, they're the one, like I say, they're the ones that know what's going on in that building.
Thank you, Mrs. Collins. I agree with you.
Thank you. And the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Steele, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Stivers. I appreciate you holding today's hearing. I think what we're discussing is a really important topic. I have a question for you, Mr. Cabrera. We have a lot of discussion in this committee, and in particular over the course of this year, about the importance of funding and how that's going to make improvements. I want to step back and also discuss what other meaningful actions we can take to solve the public housing, in particular a focus on some of the local housing authorities that seem to cause significant failures to their residents. For example, the New York City Housing Authority, the largest housing system in the country, they've been criticized for lead paint hazards, mold, heating failures, and in particular chronic mismanagement. It seems the New York City Housing Authority's failed its 400,000 residents for years, endangering their health and safety, and the authority is now working through an agreement with HUD to painstakingly address some of its longstanding problems. Could you highlight a few of the steps that we should take to ensure that local housing authorities, like the New York City Housing Authority, properly maintain their public housing units, and how we can prevent similar failures from happening across the United States?
NYCHA is in a class by itself. I can't ascribe NYCHA's issues, and they have them, on everyone else, and I'll explain why. NYCHA has 185,000 public housing units. NYCHA has 17,000 units called Michelama units. They're state units. NYCHA has another 90,000 Section 8 vouchers. 1 out of every 12 New Yorkers lives in a NYCHA property. And on top of that, there are 5 boroughs, and they have housing as a general rule that dates back to the Roosevelt administration. That's how that housing began. Now, up until the 80s, or actually the 90s, NYCHA, as a general rule, was a pretty well-performing property manager. And even during my time at HUD, it was still well-performing, just not as well-performing as it had been in prior decades. I don't know what's happened since then. I think NYCHA has a bunch of, I have to put the problem into pots. NYCHA has 11,000 employees. I want to say that again. NYCHA has 11,000 employees. That's fully 1/3 more than HUD. That's an issue. NYCHA has a difficult time getting work done because there are competing trades that want the work. So there are 12 different collective bargaining agreements at NYCHA. That's a very difficult thing for management to struggle. NYCHA has a political setting unlike nearly any other city in the country other than possibly San Francisco. And what I mean by that is there is the city council is, and forgive me, New York.
So what you're I'm going to reclaim a little time here because I only get my 5 minutes. No. And I think what you're describing is some of the bureaucratic morass that we're seeing there. I'm gonna pause there.
But most public housing authorities don't have that.
I'm gonna pause there. I think you identified a great thing that we can work on. I want to shift gears and ask you a question on lead. This is an issue that impacts both public housing and non-public housing across the United States. I want to focus in on public housing in particular. I held a roundtable recently in Wisconsin with the EPA administrator and local leaders discussing lead hazards for children. Can you comment, since your time at HUD, how we've done on making progress on lead hazards, paint, and in water in particular as it relates to public housing?
Overall, on housing, with respect to issues having to do with friable surfaces that are cracked, HUD has, for the most part, done a terrific job. Now, has it done a perfect job? Absolutely not. What does that mean? It's very difficult for HUD to react well when they don't get good data. And very often they accept bad data. That's part of the problem. I am not including, by the way, anything that's lead-based and is not dealing with paint. So I'm talking about surfaces within living units that are covered by the 3 acts, or actually the 1 act that's been amended 3 times. So how my short answer, if that's a short answer, is they've done a pretty good job with oversight. They've done a pretty good job imposing notices in most circumstances. Everything can be improved. But on the paint side, they've done well.
Seeing my time, I appreciate your time, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gooding, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We've heard a lot today, and I really appreciate you all for being here. I wanted to kind of continue with Mr. Cabrera, and then I have a quick question for Ms. Collins. Do you think that the resources that HUD has are sufficient, or do you think that we face just a problem with implementation in how they utilize those resources, or is it both?
It's both.
Feel free to elaborate.
It's both. HUD has been underfunded for the better part of 25 years in one way, shape, or form. There are a lot of reasons for that. I don't want to go into them, mostly because they're so varied, not because I don't want to talk about them. It would take us several hours, and you definitely don't want to hear me on that. Here's the problem. Regardless, there are housing authorities that own units. For the record, HUD doesn't own units. HUD owns very few units. Housing authorities own units. They own the real estate, they own the product. That's who owns the units. Owners own units. HUD provides or allocates the resources, y'all provide them. And so at the end of the day, when you tell a housing authority that has a capital need, your budget is being cut, or in fact done away with, which is a concern, a deep concern of mine, you are basically telling a resident they're going to have to either not get something solved, like bed bugs, or they're going to have to wait. And that's a bit of a problem. On the operational side, HUD has huge room for improvement, but part of their problem is what we alluded to earlier today, which is that they have a capacity problem because of retirements and departures. And every time someone departs, and someone's doing 3 jobs. And that means that nothing can really get done well. Everybody becomes a jack of all trades and a master of none.
Thank you. And Ms. Collins, thank you for being here, by the way. I'd like to hear more regarding whether you believe there's appropriate recourse or an avenue for tenants to report and inform HUD about housing requirement, urgent maintenance or repair. Meaning, obviously, I've heard there's issues with it, but do you think that what we have on the books is appropriate, or is it just not being utilized like it needs to be?
Thank you for that question. I just don't think that it's not being utilized properly. And as I said earlier, if they had tenant participation in these buildings, you won't have that many problems. Because first of all, like I said earlier, and I continue to say this, tenants are the one that lives there. So who better to ask these questions but the tenants? Involve the tenants in somewhere in this aspect of planning or whatever, as we've been asking HUD for millions of years to continue to, respond and listen to the tenants. You don't have to take everything the tenants say, but let's just give you, Nat has given recommendations time and time again that makes a lot of sense, but to HUD, it's not making any sense to them. And where do we go from there? Where we see these deplorable conditions and we still not hold them accountable. Someone has to be accountable. You're looking at children living in mold, and as some of the pictures showed, there's a child that was there because of the mold. The back of his head was almost like embedded with whatever it was. But whose fault is that? We see mold, we see asbestos, we see all of this stuff. And REACT, they have to do a better job. And they're not doing it. Because when they go to inspect, if you had tenant involvement and that 514 money was in there for the tenant association and organization to organize, you wouldn't have that problem. So we need that 514 money. We need tenants to organize and do a better job and help HUD. We're not working against HUD. We want to work with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you thank you all for being here, and I'll yield back.
Representative Sally, if I may address a question related to lead that was addressed to Mr. Cabrera earlier. Thank you very much. So I just want to make sure to address there's a gaping hole right now with respect to lead paint inspections among the federally assisted housing stock, and that's that voucher units, all voucher units across the country, and units that receive less than $5,000 in project-based Section 8 funding are actually, there's no requirement. There's a risk assessment for lead prior to a family moving into a unit, which means right now it takes a child exposed to lead paint and a child who gets poisoned before an inspector comes in and does a lead assessment. And this is impacting hundreds of thousands of voucher and project-based Section 8 families around the country. There's the Lead Safe Housing for Kids Act could easily address some of these issues by actually standardizing lead-based paint assessments among all of the federal housing programs. Thank you.
I just wanted folks to know, many of my colleagues have a caucus vote. That's why they're not here. They're not here to not want to listen to you all, and they do have copies of your testimony. But I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for their testimony today, and without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask all of our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit materials to the chair for inclusion into the record. This hearing is adjourned.